Hi everyone, Liz here. Just adding a little note before this podcast begins. I spoke with Caoimhe Butterly, back in May 2021, and we had an amazing conversation about all sorts of things, as you will hear when you tune in. Um, and the conversation then got lost in my laptop. I lost it in the jungle that is my laptop. And I just found it again the other day. But it feels important to let you know that it was recorded before the current crisis in Afghanistan. Or I've no doubt that Caoimhe and I would have been speaking about that as well. So enjoy the conversation. There's so much to learn. Caoimhe is an incredibly wise, educated, and compassionate woman. I'm sure you'll get so much from it. I know I've listened to the conversation twice myself already, which I don't normally do with my own podcast, but there's really so much to learn from Caoimhe. So I hope you learn as much as I did and you enjoyed this chat between two Irish women. Enjoy. Hello and welcome. My name is Liz Gleeson and you're listening to Shapes of Grief. Shapes of Grief is a curation of stories from international guests who share their unique experience of grief. These stories are shared with the wish that you, the listener, may find some comfort, hope, and solidarity, and maybe also the realization that you're not alone in your grief. Each time you listen, please do support the podcast by donating on the website shapesofgrief.com or by becoming a patron on patreon.com. It's a privilege to hold these conversations, and I extend my deepest gratitude to all my guests for showing up in this particular way. It truly is a gift. Welcome back to Shapes of Grief, listeners. And today I'm delighted to be joined by educator, trainer, and trainee psychotherapist Caoimhe Butterly. Caoimhe, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
And Caoimhe will be known to many Irish listeners for her work in human rights. So Caoimhe, I'm delighted you've joined me today to talk about not your human rights work, but to talk about your experience of grief related directly or indirectly to your years of activism and campaigning. So where do
Thank
we
you.
begin?
it's I was thinking what layer to begin with, but I first of all just wanted to express gratitude to you and to this space, because I think and we were chatting a little bit sort of pre the interview about sort of the public space, and when one occupies a place of sort of advocacy or sometimes interlocutor or bridge to oftentimes very profound suffering of people whose human rights are being negated or undermined, that I find on a personal basis, I sort of go into almost that delivery mode of just trying to almost get as much into interviews as I can to try and paint the broad brushstrokes of what those human rights violations entail and their impact and the trauma, and it's very rare that I get invited into a space to sort of bring in more personal distillations and reflections. And yeah, so when I was thinking sort of anticipatorily about today, I just thought it's interesting how little of our own story and narrative we bring into the spaces I think that we occupy in terms of advocacy, and I think we need to more, because our own lived histories, within the work are very much woven into, I think how we position ourselves and how we interpret and resonate with, the communities that we walk with in the work.
Very
Yeah. So
much.
thank you.
It's, I think grief is one thing that we share. It's our common humanity and
Yes.
something that grounds everybody, no matter who we are or what we know, we
Mm.
can't escape it. And I feel certainly as an educator and a trainer as well, when I'm talking, I don't refer to them or they, the bereaved. It's we feel and we experience and we
Yeah.
might be faced with, because grief is something that affects all of us. And
Mm.
no matter who we are, it's a real leveler.
Mm.
Yeah, so
Mm.
you're welcome. And I'm delighted to hold this space for you, Caoimhe, and let this voice come out. And I think where I got the idea really of speaking to you was recently. I was remembering some time that I spent in Calais a few years ago.
Mm,
And I don't know why it came to me, but I was just remembering, the news coverage of the refugee crisis 5 years ago in the Mediterranean,
mm,
and how I was so struck by what was going on in the world, and so struck by our ability to just ignore it,
mm,
um, and turn off the radio or the TV and tune into another channel. Yet when I see someone else's suffering like that, I mean, it touches my own grief, um, but also it's like how, like, because this happens with personal grief or global grief or community grief, our
mm.
ability to just switch off as communities, we can just switch off. And I wondered, I thought about you and your work, and I thought, how does she still show up smiling? Um, to do interviews or to speak to people or to educate and train. Why is Quiva not shouting at everybody, do something or wake up? And it's very like the personal grief experience when you're going
Mm.
through this desolation or this really difficult time, and the rest of the world is going about their business, doing their shopping, talking about whatever series is on Netflix, and there's such a dissonance there. So that's what sort of brought me to reach out to you to go, let's learn from Quiva a little bit about how you manage that.
Thank you. And let's co-create this space because I think even in hearing your reflections, yeah, it just brought up really interesting questions as well in terms of how we hold, the grief of witness, and then how we communicate that. How do we make it translatable and accessible? Um, and two things come up sort of predominantly for me listening to that, in the sense that I think that part of my own sort of positivity, for lack of a better word, is having probably come very close to my own mortality. And I think through that experience, of sort of survival, of sort of incidents in which other people died, in war contexts, so in Palestine and Iraq and Lebanon and Syria, through being wounded myself and sort of having that very visceral, viscerally experienced bodily experience of sort of war violence. I really resonate when I read accounts, both sort of written ones and those of friends who sort of have navigated cancer, or other illnesses and diseases, and have come out the other side in terms of just this profound gratitude for sort of every day that follows. And it doesn't mean that I don't sometimes, forget that and sort of feel, the normal range of emotions, around life, but I don't take anything at this stage sort of in life for granted. And and I think pre that as well, sort of formationally in terms of my parents and the geographical contexts that we inhabited growing up. So being born in Ireland and then childhood in Canada and Zimbabwe and Mauritius and then New York and Latin America and the Middle East, etc. It in a way, I almost feel like I've lived my life in motion and, sort of constantly adapting and learning from the different cultural and geographical contexts that I've lived in. And I think within that, it's almost sort of the pause of observation. When you're entering into a new cultural context, a new geographical context, you have to relearn, parts of yourself. There's a certain amount of, I think, identity reformation, even when that those shifts are done with choice and the privilege of passports and citizenships and everything else that I carried with me in those journeys. But I think certainly having sort of navigated learning Spanish and then Arabic and having been in a position of very deep listening, with communities as those languages began to sort of take shape, linguistically, semantically, but then also in sort of my own internal landscape. Um, I think through that observation, I always just feel very and have felt very grateful for those glimpses always, even in the midst of very visceral, profound suffering, of sort of the resistance of joy, and of people creating beauty with intentionality in their lives, of the relational piece of love and compassion and, sort of a hand on an arm or, a hand on a face or, but just how beautifully supportive of each other people oftentimes in extremely adverse conditions begin. So I'll relate that back to sort of the coming home piece, which I think when I spend long periods of time in refugee camps or other contexts, I actually feel a lot of, even though that dissonance piece is there, but when I walk down a street in somewhere like Dublin and see school children on their way to school without having to flinch and have almost sort of the topography of war, embodied in their reactions to sound, or external stimuli, um, that I always just feel almost sort of weepy, but it's a weepiness that has also deep relief in it. When I go into a grocery store and see people being able to access food security and and on all of the multitude of things that are so easy to take for granted. Um, yeah, no, I oftentimes I'm relieved, and it doesn't mean in any way that, that critique of, the systems of profound inequality that exist in our world in terms of privilege and access, to resources, in terms of access to basic fundamental human rights is absent. But it does mean, that I derive a lot of happiness from seeing sort of normalcy, normalcy built on privilege oftentimes, but just families and individuals being able to experience things in sort of the spectrum of human experience that are on its sort of extreme edges in terms of suffering.
Mm.
Um,
There's something there, Caoimhe, about death anxiety and death denial, which most of the population
mm,
have that, that umbrella over our heads. We
mm,
pretend it's not going to happen and we plan our future as if we're going to live forever. And, you've touched on some experiences that you've been through where you were faced with your own mortality, and you've likened that to friends who've been through cancer, which also makes us face our mortality in many cases as well. And there's something about coming close to death and really looking death in the face
mm.
that has enabled you to find the joy in life, the privilege in life, the gratitude for living, the gratitude for every day. So there's something, we talk about post-traumatic growth, that's
Yeah.
the new buzzwords. There's something about every trauma or every difficult life situation or every difficult diagnosis, with the right supports, with the right information, with the right resources, we can somehow catalyze that into something else.
Definitely, and increasingly, I've begun to sort of think in terms of personal and collective processes, but of ontologies of trauma. That it is very much a way of knowing, a way of being, um, and vis-a-vis post-traumatic growth. And I love that you made that disclaimer because I think it can be quite romanticized and fetishized. And oftentimes create this sort of dichotomy almost of worthiness if one isn't sort of resilient in one's sort of growth, past trauma, that somehow, people are deficient in some way. And I find I listen to that discourse of post-traumatic growth, both with recognition because I recognize it in myself, but also with sometimes a certain weariness, because I think that so much of, as you so rightfully said, the conditions that can exist or not exist are oftentimes structural, in terms of rights, in terms of resources, in terms of, just, I think,
Privilege.
access, privilege, exactly, power, and then that layer of access or non-access to, sort of trauma-informed, integrative, you know, psychosocial and beyond, if people are in a place of safety to actually access ongoing psychotherapeutic or psychiatric supports or psychological supports, but that is so dependent on privilege. So oftentimes, when I'm with, particularly these days, refugee, asylum seeker and migrant communities, I find myself constantly searching for language because I want to speak to people's bravery and their endurance and their tenacity and their strength. But I'm so conscious, even though I love the foundations of the word resilience. I love what it means at its roots. I love its potentiality, but I think it's also a word that has been quite co-opted, in terms of a lot of discourses, and in some ways almost diluted in terms of emancipatory meaning, a resilience that is based on freedom and recognition, not only of the individual endurance, but of collective conditions that allow for freedom and justice and access to rights. Um,
It
and
almost
and
implies choice as well, doesn't it? Like
yeah,
you're choosing to be a certain way, you're choosing to be resilient, you're choosing
yes,
to go down the path of post-traumatic growth as
yeah,
opposed to perpetual trauma. And
yeah.
that those choices are not available to everybody at all, as you said.
Yeah. And as well as, that lack of availability in terms of those choices, I oftentimes, as you mentioned, Liz, the context of camps such as Calais, such as Lesbos, such as Adomini, Lampedusa, all of these sites of quite deep, injustice, and I'd say conditions, that are really tantamount in many ways to, psychological violence, in terms of, that's so often, and I think this is playing itself out in, research done in, institutionalized contexts such as direct provision in the camps, in contexts of containment and deterrence, that it is not the trauma in the country of origin. Oftentimes it's not the war, it's not the experiences of extreme suffering that people leave, and migrate away from, flee from. It is oftentimes, the trauma of subjecthood, of personhood, of diminishment, of the humiliations, the subtle degradations of enforced dependency, of the denial, of one's agency, within camp contexts. And I've seen that so often, particularly with a lot of women that I've worked with who are survivors, of systematic sexual gender-based violence, in detention centers in Libya, who have survived, wars, who have survived, extreme loss, multiple losses in terms of, surviving aerial bombardments, and they survive and they keep it together, and they oftentimes do so for their children and for the families who are dependent on them. And they get to camp contexts, where everything that they knew of themselves in terms of that resilience and bravery and tenacity, is just undermined day by day by day. And it's so deeply disempowering. And it really feels that oftentimes on a policy level, that like the perfect storm, you couldn't think up, a context, that is more injurious to people's mental health than a lot of these camp contexts. And yet within them, as I'm sure you've witnessed in Calais and elsewhere, I oftentimes think of camps, and I'm sure many people who have visited think similarly, but of sites of oppression, but also of resistance and of dissent and of beauty and community and joy. And I'm thinking here of Calais, in the beautiful sort of sacred piece of inside, the little plywood Eritrean church, the billowing clouds of incense and the iconography and that process of people trying to find meaning, in the libraries, in the cultural centers, the beautiful Good Hope Theatre dome, in which art and music and revelry, was
That's where I
created.
was. I was doing dance there. That's where
Amazing.
that's where I camped. But my mind's
Oh,
just going nuts with things I want to say, Quiva. And I think this point you're making, that there can be a trauma, from the war, whatever's going on in the home country, and people survive that and they get out. But where the real damage is done is where the supports aren't there.
yes.
People are diminished, people are dehumanized, they're given numbers,
Yeah.
and their name cease to be used. Like, this is where the real damage is going on. And often we see this on the personal level in grief as well. Somebody might come to me because their mother died, but when they walk in, it's actually their husband who is not supporting them, or
Yeah.
their circle of friends who don't understand their grief.
Yes.
Just last night I was speaking with Fiona Toomey, who's an Irish mom. She's got two daughters, and Millie
Mm,
died by suicide 5 years
mm,
ago. And we talk about this exactly, that, um, the trauma and shock and devastation of losing your little girl,
Mm.
and in that traumatic way as well. But what's almost more shocking is Fiona said she expected the Calvary to come out. Where is all the
Yes.
support? Where is everybody? But instead, it's this, people in their own lack of education and not knowing what to do,
Mm.
or not wanting the contagion effect, or, not willing to look at their own privilege, um, the loneliness then, and the shame and the dehumanization and the blame, and could you have done something different, or it's your own fault, or these sort of discourses that can happen around a suicide or a child's death. And it's similar, so I'm trying to sort of correlate the collective experience, or the culture, the community experience, to the personal experience here. Or the other really good example is the children in Sweden who
Yes.
are falling asleep for months,
Yes.
and it's
Mm.
not because of the trauma that they fled from. We can survive trauma, we can survive hard things.
Mm.
Where it gets really difficult is when we're not offered support and hope and acknowledgement. And
Mm.
in fact, these children are fleeing difficult scenarios at home, and they arrive somewhere thinking that they'll be safe, and then they're being told, we don't know if you're safe yet, we don't know if you can stay here yet, we
Yeah.
might know next week, we might know next month, we might know next year. And it's too much on the
Yes.
psyche, and these children are sleeping for months and months and months.
Mm. Mm. I recently heard that so resonates. I recently heard a description of sort of, a rip in the sort of the psychic fabric. And I almost feel, like when that rip just begins to happen, when everything that kept that fabric, sort of with integrity whole, begins to rip. It's so devastating to witness. I was on a panel last week that included a child psychiatrist who works with MSF in Lesbos. She's Danish, and she spoke so powerfully and movingly to her despair in looking into the eyes of this little girl that she described, a 7-year-old, and seeing her despair. And she referred to some of the children that she works with as turtle children, where the only place, that is safe to recede to is within themselves, within, their shell, and sort of, the nonverbal reality of a lot of that, the sort of the shut in, and in many ways, that shame and guilt that you so movingly described, I think, vis-a-vis parents, in the aftermath of suicide or the death of a child, of death of a child in that broad frame. But just the lack of language that exists around acknowledgement, around something, that can build that frame of resonance, I think. And when I was watching a video, on one of the videos that you've produced for the site, I thought how beautiful, just having that almost psychoeducational piece of these are some of the words that people say, are soothing, and it doesn't mean in any way that it takes that edge of that daily pain away, but it shows that you are seen, that you are heard, and that if people, even when they're saying them clumsily, with clumsiness or with hesitation, that they're really trying to row in with you as best, as they can, as a friend or a community member or a family member. And I think that's the difference that makes the difference, vis-a-vis a lot of trauma, that community buffer, the collectively lived experience. And that probably sort of, in a way, is a segue back to your initial question in terms of the coming home process. And here I'm thinking of, for refugees for whom home is still very insecure. Home, means that decision on an asylum, sort of, process that might come in a paper a week, a month, a year, 5 years, 7 years, down the road of sort of, not knowing whether it's safe to put down roots. But the isolation in that, because the collective that kept you, I think, in a way, psychologically, emotionally, existentially safer, is suddenly gone. And it's the isolation then of living on the margins, oftentimes, in terms of precarity. I think particularly for women, but not exclusively women, but for parents. So many families that I work with in sort of an advocacy and human rights context, I'm so aware, that those parents will work oftentimes well below their skill set, probably for the rest of their lives. I know an amazing woman from Mosul in Iraq, who was the head of a school for years. She's a consummate educator. She is, just so enthused and, just amazingly energetic about, different educational methodologies and pedagogies, and she still researches, and she's working as a cleaner now in her children's school, here in France. I think of parents for whom, they sacrifice, oftentimes, so much of their personhood, in the hopes that their children will be able to have, lives of more safety, dignity, possibility, choice. Um, and I see that oftentimes. I think the most impactful volunteers that I've witnessed in camp contexts such as Calais and Lesbos, in camps in the Balkans, etc., have been second generation volunteers. So I'm thinking Swedish Palestinians or Canadian Iranians, or Danish Iraqis, or because when these young, bright, brilliant, compassionate, oftentimes multilingual, highly educated, creative, dynamic young people walk into a camp, parents sitting in their tents in all of the humiliation and diminishment of that experience can see their children in those young people, and they can see that it's worth it. This journey, eventually, if not for them, eventually, hopefully, will translate, into that second or third generation of their children and grandchildren having lives in which dignity is more accessible than, the context oftentimes of extreme conflict that they've fled.
They
Um,
really represent hope and possibility.
oh, hugely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Caoimhe, can I bring us back to you and the personal? Um, what was your first experience of loss, significant loss?
I pre this interview, I was thinking, and because I was chatting with my mother, who's a psychotherapist who works with trauma and survivors of sexual gender based violence, amongst other losses and suffering. But I was thinking I've been comparatively and privileged, that my, knock on wood, my immediate family of origin are safe and well and healthy. My immediate friend circle, as it is constituted now, some have died over the years. But I think I was an adult before I started to experience a lot of loss other than that of my grandparents, my lovely grandparents. So in my adult life, I've experienced the very violent deaths of friends in war contexts. But in my childhood, we had losses that were different, in the sense of maybe sort of transition from country context to country context, in the sense of what you lose and what you gain in that process. But I didn't navigate deep grief. Um, but what I find when I look at my own child now, who's 10, interesting, when I think back to myself at his age and younger, I almost sort of feel like there was sort of this prescient voice from a very young age that knew that I'd come into contact with other people suffering. And I remember, sort of in terms of formational experiences, some of my youngest memories from childhood were reading in a Canadian school system the Diary of Anne Frank at maybe age 8 or 9, and just having this sense of everything sort of changing, through that reading. It was a lens into genocide. It was a lens into, huge human suffering, that I had gotten glimpses of sort of pre that through my parents having been engaged in, sort of liberation theology type social justice activism, within their church. And we hosted as a family, refugees, boat people, people who arrived by boat, who made the journey by boat from Cambodia. So I had these little glimpses, And then when we began to travel, I had bigger glimpses. I felt like the frame became much wider. We lived in a post-colonial context in Zimbabwe, and through friends who were politically active there, I began to understand not only sort of human rights violations, but also response to that, people organizing, people, in that context, sort of pre-liberation, organizing and fighting against colonialisms. Um, and then as an adult, I think, that the sort of more visceral losses came closer to home. Um, and I know because we chatted sort of pre this program, just because his 10th anniversary came up recently. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, but the sort of the prism of the birth of my beautiful boy, Tig, whom I wasn't aware of, which is another story until he was sort of 6.5 months gestation, and when I think in retrospect of sort of what I was navigating while I was pregnant with him in terms of trauma, it was a processing time in which I'm sure my system was flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, and because I was processing and remembering. And but a week before he was born, a very close friend and fellow sort of campaigner and activist and humanitarian, a lovely Italian guy called Vittorio Arrigoni, was kidnapped and then assassinated in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, where we lived, a bunch of us who were volunteering there. Um, and I think what it brought up, first of all, was the shock of he was executed by Palestinians, which, because in a way, when we went to Gaza, there was an expectation, that possibly, one could end up injured or facing the possibility of death vis-a-vis Israeli bombardments. But we never felt unsafe, amongst the very loving community that was hosting us. So I think it was sort of that shock, and then and it was by a group that was affiliated to Al Qaeda, um, and then it was sort of, in a way, I was about to welcome this new life into my life, and my system, as you so I think lovely, so presently in a way pointed out, but it was being flooded, both by sort of the oxytocin post birth plus, these heavy layers, of grief. And it really, in a way, made me so conscious, I think, of that duality, of life and death, of trauma and resilience, of, endurance and suffering. Um, and when my little boy was born, I almost felt like that I owed it to him and to myself. I owed it to those who continue to live. I owed it to the family of Vittorio, to those who continue to live, to use whatever time I personally have on this planet sort of wisely and with commitment and with integrity, but also really to do the work on myself in the sense of a recognition of intergenerational trauma. Um, and it's something that I'm conscious of, not only in terms of my own child, that all that I've sort of lived and probably didn't get the amount of resourcing that I should have around. But it's something that really informs a lot of the work that I do now in terms of trying to better resource humanitarians and human rights campaigners, as well as the refugee communities that I work with in terms of traumatic witness. So how can we build in, a much more robust system of care? How can we build in an awareness of sort of limits of endurance, into the autonomic nervous system, into, the cognitive and physiological impacts of trauma, into more embodied practice, but also how can that psychoeducational piece be woven in intrinsically into the structures of humanitarian, human rights, emergency response, etc. organizations. Because in their absence, what I've witnessed is people, and I can see myself in them. And that's why I almost feel like when I'm working and facilitating processes with people who are sort of on those front lines, there's so much shame and guilt involved in terms of people just saying, I can't do more. I can't be in the witness of too much more pain before it just seeps and overflows from whatever container, that widens and widens and widens, I think, to be able to absorb and subsume, this witness of suffering. Um, but what I think the people, particularly the younger people that I work with, can see is that I've walked that walk, and I've walked the walk to the point that I was so overwhelmed, by that pain, and had to find sort of mechanisms, of self-regulation within that, of just being in a space in which I could be as regulated as possible, in recognition of that intersubjective space, that interrelational space with the communities that I was working with. Um, and it was only when I sort of took that step back, that I think what has become a cliche, that you have to be able to resource yourself before you can resource others, really took on a much deeper truth for me. I know that intrinsically. I know it in my body. I know it in my psyche. I know it in my soul. That in order for me to walk this walk with people, I have to do the work, on myself. And I see that in a way as doing the work on myself, doing the work, on the legacy in a way intergenerationally. I know that Ty perhaps has inherited in terms of my witness. But I also do that work, I think, in the sense of there's so much ego oftentimes, unfortunately, still wrapped up in a lot of humanitarian work, in the sense of a non-recognition of the humility of our bodies, the humility of our psyches, of our spirits. And I think through entering into that place, of humility and accountability to ourselves and to others, it just makes the quality of the work both more sustainable, but I think also more impactful. Because communities who are on the blunt end of oppression or violence do not need dysregulated, stressed out, burnt out, sort of people, trying to sort of
Heroes.
bring themselves, oh, completely, and all of the
Yeah.
savior-esque sort of dynamics
Yeah.
go with that. But even if they don't see themselves in that sort of savior frame, to go beyond a place of sort of burnout or rust out,
Mm.
is not ultimately, I think, when a lot of people make this journey, what they're striving to, which are lives of, as well as dignity and safety, but also of joy, and my best teachers have been oftentimes, in refugee camp contexts where people see me, sort of at 2 a.m. still translating, for medical teams and not having slept more than like 3 hours a night, for weeks. And I've had, friends in those contexts, themselves refugee seekers, come up to me and saying, go home, Caoimhe, go to sleep, have a shower. It's okay. Nothing dramatic is going to change structurally or systemically if you go to sleep. And with humor, but yeah, and I almost feel like now at a older age, I feel I want to be that person for younger humanitarians, to be able to say, it's okay to resource yourself. It's okay, to step back, take a break, take a pause. And in doing so, yeah,
And
it
admit
just
you're human,
totally,
You
yeah.
said something there, Caoimhe, about needing to learn how to regulate yourself and self-regulate, and the mechanisms you found to do that. Would you speak a
Mm,
little bit about those specific mechanisms? What, like in practical terms, because I think we talk so broadly about trauma and all these concepts, but it's like, what does it actually mean? And for people listening, they're like, I think I might have that, or I think I might need that, but what is it? And I love to just, break things down into really simple language. So back to the personal griever again, grief can
mm,
really dysregulate us. It's,
yeah.
as I say to some people, it's like someone has taken a sledgehammer to our nervous system.
Mm,
And it's, we're like this, where we should be like this, we're like this. And
yeah.
and we need to find ways to regulate ourselves again.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, just to tie in something you said way earlier, you said something about when we've been through trauma, it's almost like it becomes a way of living. It's like a way of being.
Yes.
And and I said this to Fiona yesterday because we were in an educational setting one day, and I knew Millie's story, but I
Mm,
didn't know Fiona. And so when she was in the class, I didn't know that she was Millie's mom.
mm,
And I said this to her. But I said, I knew that you had been through something because you were so present. It's like there's
mm,
this presence in somebody's eyes that
mm,
tells me they are so awake and aware and sensitive.
yeah.
I don't know if this resonates with you, but
Mm,
there's something about going through a significant bereavement or a significant hardship or
Yeah.
a trauma or something that brings us so fully into ourselves, it's scary.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
can recognize these people. Um,
Without a doubt. And in the same way, I think that there's a trauma register vis-a-vis other survivors. I think there's very much a grief register. And I've spoken to a lot of people who feel that viscerally when they enter into a room, as you did, with Fiona, with Millie's mom, um, and and towards that, I've oftentimes thought, in a way, if we're talking about regulation, one thing that is so jarringly dysregulating, for a lot of people who have experienced and survived trauma is hypervigilance. Um, and I definitely experienced that myself for years. I still experience that oftentimes. It comes up. I enter into a shop, or to a crowded space, and I'm continually scanning, for an escape, or an exit in which people can exit safely if there's an explosion, if somebody opens fire, and it's that continual sort of looping back to safety, which is not as activating on a physiological level to me, as it used to be, because I can put sort of a frame of sort of logic or sort of cognitive processing around that to almost sort of dispel, that hypervigilance. But what I've experienced on a personal level, and I've heard echoed in the experience of other people who have lived through, in this case, trauma, although I'm sure there's a lot of echoing and mirroring in terms of grief, is that hypervigilance, with time, with doing the work of self resourcing, I find becomes almost sort of an emotional register where instead of scanning for danger, I scan almost in terms of the registers, that interrelational, sort of resonance with people in the room. And more often than not, in the same way that you picked up on that, I often, and I think a lot of people often, pick up on people who are in presence, or who have just that almost, just that space, when you make eye contact, that you feel, they've survived something, and maybe they're present to their own mortality, and all of the register of emotions. And, and I'm not trying in any way to put a romantic frame of gratitude around everything for being alive, because sometimes surviving when other people don't, brings with it a lifelong grief, a lifelong pain. Um, but I think in terms of the self-regulation piece, certainly what I found useful over the years, is a lot of, for instance, Stephen Porges, Porges' work around the autonomic nervous system. I think Peter Levine's work around, I've sort of reframed it in my own mind, instead of trauma vortex and healing vortex, but almost sort of the pools, a trauma pool and a healing pool. And I think that's because, like, water is most definitely my resource, whether that's sea or rivers or waterfalls, or whenever I'm in a space in which I just really need to decompress my mind, my spirit, my body, if I'm walking by any water source, if I can listen to a water source, that is, sort of for me, the ultimate regulator. I also think of breath work, coherent breath work, which interestingly, I remember I was at a conference in which I watched a presentation on it, and I began to do it, and it really resonated. And it's been used, with survivors of 9/11, with sort of combat veterans, with refugee communities. It was used in Haiti in the aftermath of the earthquake. And I remember I was in Haiti in the aftermath of that earthquake. And I remember, because I was working more in education at that stage, with small schools, and so many of the teachers, were coming to us saying, we need sort of psychosocial skills, resourcing skills to be able to work with the children that are coming in every day, because, they're having night terrors, they're wetting their bed, they're having fitful sleep, they're having recurrent intrusive memories, they're dysregulated, there's conflict, there's anger, they're processing and working stuff out. And I remember at the time, this was, I had sort of stuff from my mom, because I think growing up with a psychotherapist and a trauma therapist, like, yeah, I've always been surrounded by her books, and, and so I've always gleaned off of her practice and her studies, but I hadn't gone through any, formal formational process or study process myself. So I was Googling stuff and trying to bring in resources. But I remember watching a video from Haiti after the earthquake years later at a trauma conference in Belfast, in which they did this beautiful series of sort of exercises with the children around coherent breath work. And it was sort of the branches reaching out into the sky and the rudeness and the stars. And all of these little children just fell asleep. They just, so they're in the middle of their breath work and they just plopped into these little cushions and they were asleep in this very deep, restful sleep. And I think in a way, like the freedom that can be offered, that by a lot of sort of self-regulatory exercises, whether, a friend today was running a workshop in emotional freedom technique, and tapping. And I think it's very much sort of a mixed bag. Not everything resonates with everybody. There's some things that will resonate, other things that won't. But it's exploring, and really acknowledging, I think, with deep integrity, that the body does hold the score. That it is the vessel, for all of these processes, that we try and navigate. And towards that, I think of, amazing. I think visionary therapists, slash activists such as Rasmia Menachem and Nakamandefo and Angel Acosta and all these emergent voices in the United States who are very much holding the personal embodied process within a frame of meaning making, of social justice, of denial of right, of racial trauma, of intergenerational trauma. And it brings it past just sort of embodied trauma therapy or, sort of talk therapy, or psychotherapeutic resourcing into a recognition, that the context is so important. And as somebody who sort of straddles those two worlds between human rights activism and campaigning and advocacy, and, over the last 5 years now, psychotherapeutic processes, I find that they speak to that space that I inhabit and want to inhabit more, in the sense of bringing in that sort of psychoeducational frame into the rights-based work, and then bringing the rights-based work into a psychotherapeutic community, in the sense of saying that a duty of care extends past the therapeutic, encounter. It extends into advocacy. It extends into when we're working with communities of people who are being re-traumatized by systems like direct provision, of speaking out, of amplifying those voices, in an anonymized context. But I think there are so many ways in which we can, and I say this as a rookie, in this journey, but in which we can, as therapists or emergent therapists, really hold a space of witness, in the interpersonal, and then witness in the broader systemic framework, in which people are navigating trauma, grief, dislocation, identity reformation, and then also all of the normal stuff that comes up. And that always, I think, when I'm sort of working with fellow trainees, I really try and speak to that. So many, I think, people go into sort of the therapeutic space with refugees and asylum seekers, sort of assuming that it will all be trauma and it will all be heavy. And oftentimes, there's just the normal stuff of life as well, and transitions and developmental stages and relationship, and oftentimes a lot of really wry humor, woven in there as well, as only survivors, I think, can best do. Um, but but yeah,
That's
it's
so true.
a
And
journey.
Caoimhe, I love your
Mm.
point about, it's not enough just to provide therapy in a small 1 hour framework, but we have a duty of care to change the system if we can, that's
If we
doing the
can,
damage, and um, it comes to a point where we're complicit if we're not doing something, if we're
mm,
just turning a blind eye and continuing to exist in a system that's causing oppression, and then we're making money out of supporting people who are being oppressed by the system that we're supporting. And
mm.
this can go around and around. And I suppose,
Without the shame, because I almost sort of think, people do what they can, and sometimes it's hard to
yeah,
change the whole system, but in the small ways that we can, to bear witness, yeah, it
yeah.
it all
But
it
I
all helps.
think I think the message is we all can do something. Like there,
Yeah.
we can. It's not like if we're sitting back and going, "Oh, that's awful," but there's nothing I can do. I would say to people, think again, and it can be small. And one of the ways that I did that was by setting up the podcast. I thought, here's person after person coming in with their grief and thinking that they're doing something wrong, or they're not normal, or they're not grieving properly, because nobody's talking about grief in the common discourse, not enough anyway, pre-pandemic certainly. So I
Mm.
thought, okay, I'll do a podcast. I'd never even listened to a podcast, before I set up my podcast at my kitchen table. But
Amazing.
it is amazing, because I
Mhm.
remember saying to my kids, hey, 10 people have listened. I interviewed my cousin. My cousin was my first guest, and he talked beautifully about his bereavement and what it meant to lose a friend, and trying to navigate the friendship status, and what was his role, and where did he fit in the hierarchy of the bereaved. But I
Mhm.
remember saying to the kids, wow, 10 people have listened, and I was delighted. I thought, there's 10 people, and now the podcast has over 100,000 listens.
Wow.
So it's there's something in there that me, who wasn't that technical, had never even listened to a podcast and set it up, um, and just thought, people have a story, they want to tell their story, so it'll help the people telling their story, but it'll also help maybe 10, 20, 30 people who hear the story, and that way my work can get out there and make a little bit of a difference, or and then from that has been people saying, this is really educational, I'm really learning. And then
Mm.
from that, now this new educational program has grown of, well, let's be explicitly educational. Let's actually,
Yeah.
let's do this. Why not? Why not me? Why not me? Like, we go, this is
Completely.
somebody else's job. So this is
No.
somebody else is the trainer, the educator, or the big grief wig in the world. And then it's like, well, they're not doing it. They're not offering affordable, accessible grief education. So why don't I do it? And it's not perfect. It won't be perfect. It doesn't cover everything, but it's a start. It's something. Um, yeah.
Completely. And I love this because I don't think it's entirely gendered, but I do think a lot of women, who do amazing work oftentimes undervalue that work or doubt that work or minimize, that work in terms of its impact and its resonance with people. And in many ways, I think podcasts and the internet are sort of the ultimate leveler in many ways, in the sense of, these stories matter, these voices matter, these stories resonate with people, and exactly, why not you? And I think you're so well positioned in terms of empathy, and as I've got a glimpse of even in our exchanges pre this podcast, in really finding people's stories, and leaning into people's experiences of grief and trauma in a very heartfelt way. And what really for me was, again, the difference that made the difference in terms of when you got in contact was, I think there's a lovely holding both of, that space, that sort of boundaried space, simultaneously, with a lovely warming of space. And I think so much of a lot of foundational training still, unfortunately, around psychotherapeutic practice emphasizes boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. And it doesn't emphasize enough, what does it mean? Boundaries can be a privilege in themselves, to sort of try and step back from the intensity of people's pain. And it doesn't mean that we can't be there in a contained space, that is regulating. But it does also mean, that I think we need to challenge ourselves collectively to really lean into those spaces, that bring up, I think, sometimes discomfort, that bring up shame, that bring up, for that witness of systems that are failing people. But I think COVID, in a way, on so many levels, I've seen this, in so many different iterations of, in the apartment complex that we live, we have a big shared garden, and the my neighbors, who know, that I've been doing, this training, and are in the process of, they were in the process of accreditation, coming up to me and opening up in ways that I don't think they would, sort of pre, this global pause, pre, the possibility of people facing their mortality or those of others, pre the vulnerability, that has emerged. um, And I think there's something, beautiful to that vulnerability if it can be held in a national conversation in which, there is actual resourcing, not just lip service paid, oftentimes by multiple governments around the world to mental health and psychosocial resourcing during the pandemic, but into actually resourcing systems of care that row in with people, that respond to the crisis that so many young people in Ireland, are navigating, to the isolation of that get beyond just having language around that, but actually robust systems of care and supports, that people can access, that parents don't have to be on waiting lists for months, as that despair grows, watching, their children's overwhelm. There's, I think there's so many openings and potentials for change within this. And then also a valuing, of people that maybe, people's stories that maybe were more invisible to people. And I think that in a very tangible sense, vis-a-vis healthcare workers and frontline workers and care workers and SNAs and, and shop workers and hauliers and, all of these oftentimes, particularly for people, in more precarious positions, but work that is invisibilized, into people recognizing, that oftentimes, like I felt at the beginning of the pandemic, like I've worked on Palestinian, and Iraqi and other ambulances, alongside profoundly brave paramedics, and witnessed that enormous endurance, but I only have EMT training and that's in other countries, so to go back and train and get accreditation in Ireland, as a single parent at the beginning of the pandemic probably wasn't my most logical route of engaging in solidarity work. So instead I engaged, in psychotherapeutic sort of resourcing, but I was so conscious of how redundant my skill set became. And I think for people who have learned, in one aspect, in the sense of, frontline healthcare response, but I think for people who have taken the mediums that we have, in this case, you using podcasts, you using, creating the videos, putting them out there, it can be such a freedom enhancing space for everybody who witnesses that. Because then I think all people who have deep, nuanced reflections, about life, about what they navigate, about what they witness. I think it opens that space for storytelling. It opens that space for learning and for confidence. Like, of course, and I love the fact that you do your podcasts in your kitchen, and it just speaks to, in a way, it's kneading that dough. There's so many metaphors involved in there, cooking the pots, sort of, but also just creating, a space of nurture for people, because in this time of contraction, I think, other than, yes, we've all been baking a lot of bread, but the soul nurture, that some people, and I count myself as enormously privileged to have living parents for whom, we're now living for these months, and we've sort of formed our little orca pod and we're experiencing this together. But I know so many people who have navigated such profound re-emergent grief and loneliness, in these contracted times. And it really speaks to, and then I'll stop talking, but in a way, like how in that expansion back into a space of social interaction, of sensory sort of input, to everything that has been that little bit much more quieter and regulated in the past year and a bit, how people will reemerge, into lives, I'm sure, that still have meaning, but maybe that meaning will be slightly altered. And what are those spaces of engagement, education, and action that we can take, if there is that dissonance, that people decide the frenetic pace of their lives pre-pandemic, and maybe the priorities of their lives pre-pandemic, maybe have shifted. And how can we collectively knead that dough of hopefully social change and, yeah, just more widespread rights within that.
And I think to boil it all down to the essence of kindness and
Yes.
turning towards people rather than away from. And,
Yes.
you mentioned there just sensory, like just touch.
Mm,
Touch can be amazing, and touch doesn't even need to be physical. And
yes.
I really see the power of that working with people on Zoom. And, most people who come looking for my support are not coming with a normal adaptive grief response. They're coming because something is askew, or there's been a trauma there, or they're very distressed and they want help. They're looking for help. And sometimes, when you talk about boundaries as well, I think sometimes boundaries are a cop out to being human, and humanity and kindness can go a very long way in psychotherapy. I mean, I think we need to
Mhm.
understand our boundaries, but then know when to be flexible and when to put them
Completely.
down and when to put them
Completely.
aside, and
Yeah.
to say to someone, would you be willing to just feel my warm, strong hand on your back right now?
Mm. Mm.
And through the screens, how we can see somebody's nervous system just completely settle and their
Yeah.
shoulders drop.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a sob that's been kept inside for weeks or months on end. But
Mm.
it's like that metaphorical or literal, you know,
Yes.
it used to be literal, now it's metaphorical, that metaphorical hand and warmth. And in terms of working with trauma, in terms of working with grief, a
Mm.
human just saying, I see you.
Yes.
And I want to touch you,
Mm.
not literally, or maybe literally, can go a very, very long way, because we can get so wrapped up in policies, procedures, formulas, processes, strategies, pathways. Um, and at the end of the day, we're human. And,
Yeah.
I think for people who have experienced a trauma or have experienced a significant loss, it's almost like we are dealing with an infant again, or a child. They can feel so scared and so alone. And, the lovely Irvin Yalom, who I interviewed the other day, he says, I felt like he's 89, and he's a psychiatrist. He's got, I don't know how many hundreds of books he's written, but he's the god of many psychotherapists. And he writes in his latest book, I felt just like a child and I wanted someone to rescue me.
Mm.
Um, and
Mm.
Fiona and I speak about this in our chat yesterday as well, around suicide bereavement. Just how can we acknowledge that vulnerability and that very young person that emerges, that
Yes.
just needs to hear someone say, you're going to survive this, and I've got you. We've
Mm.
got this together. I will
Mm.
accompany you. I can't do it for you, but I will run alongside you and I will throw you gels or drinks or whatever resources you need. And
Mm.
I'll see this marathon through with you. That's half the battle, isn't it? Um,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And in a way, as you speak, I'm just thinking of, Liz, in a way, sort of the difference between regulatory ethics and process-based ethics, and how we hold that space of sort of the regulated space in a therapeutic context, and the safeguarding space, and the formulaic sort of boxes, and then how you hold that space of people's self-agency, as adults, in terms of the co-constructed space, and as you were speaking, it actually brought up a really sort of two poignant, or actually three poignant memories. One is of, in oftentimes, in the Middle East, that people oftentimes, sort of as a show of sort of respect, or there's a hand placed on the heart, sort of as greeting in some contexts, not all. I'm not trying to homogenize or essentialize the entire very broad, diverse region, um, but there, I've always, yeah, just there's a deep dignity oftentimes to that. Um, when decoupled from sometimes its gendered expressions. Um, there's also a memory that's coming up when working in a refugee camp in Lesbos called Curated, of a profoundly brave, very beautiful, very deeply suffering Yazidi woman, sister called Nadia, who had survived horrific experiences after having been kidnapped by ISIS and witnessed the execution of her brothers, and survived and survived. And her younger sister, Layla, was a wheelchair user and a student, and had been kidnapped by ISIS when their town, Sinjar, was overtaken, invaded by ISIS, and was never found. And so they've never been able to have real closure around knowing whether she's alive or dead. Not that, and I think closure in itself is an overused term,
Ambiguous
because
loss.
yes,
Yeah.
ambiguous loss,
Yeah.
yeah, but at least an understanding of whether to mourn on another level to the mourning that they're already doing when hope is still present that they might eventually find her.
Mm.
Um, but I remember in an encounter that I had with her, we were saying goodbye, and I had a bracelet and then these solidarity funds from other women in Ireland, that I was passing on to women in the camp, and it's so hard, I think, when for people who are so deeply dignified to accept money in any form, because it can be humiliating, it can be diminishing, and I felt long and hard about the words, the phrases that I put around, very discreetly passing those funds on to women in different camp contexts in ways that don't, perpetuate that feeling of diminishment or humiliation. So I was languishing those in Arabic, and she refused it. And she was a mom of other kids and a survivor, and extremely precarious, as in real precarity. And as I passed them, I said, from a sister to a sister, and she dissolved, because sister to her, was Layla. She was her absent Layla. um, and I ended up holding her for what felt like so long, as she just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed, and we breathed together by the end of this, and I was crying and she was crying, because it was so visceral. um, but I thought of, in that moment, if I was seeing her in a therapeutic context in Ireland, would have there been this space, just for that sister to sister, even in its, not the real sister, not Layla, but woman to woman, person to person, just holding space. Um, and then the third thing that came to mind as you did that beautiful gesture of the hand, was a few days ago, I visited the Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum across the border in Geneva with Tig, and they have a chamber of witnesses, or a chamber of testimonies, and they're activated. So they're big screens. They're activated. So each testimony, the person who delivers the testimony, and amongst them, um, was a Colombian migrant worker who had survived trafficking, and an Afghan health worker who had survived, a double amputation after an explosion, and an ex-Guantanamo Bay prisoner, and this multitude of voices, a young child soldier from Darfur. But the still video of them is just them staring into camera, and their hand is held up. And to activate their testimony, you press your hand, and then with all of the COVID regulations afterwards, they lots of sanitation sort of processes, but you touch your hand to the hand of the screen, and then they begin to talk, and it's translated into multiple languages. And Tyke, who is 10, who has come to camps with me, and probably in a way, in retrospect, I politicized, or at least his environment, maybe that little bit too soon, but I want him to understand privilege and justice and rights and solidarity. But he's come into camps through the lens, oftentimes, of play, of football, of painting, of making friendships amongst kids from a multiplicity of different experiences. But as the testimonies began, I was sort of reassessing: is this too much? And I asked him, should we move on to another part of the museum, and I could come back there later? And he said, "No, Mom, I want to hear what they have to say." And we talked and we processed it afterwards, and went on a long walk in this beautiful gardens. Um, but there was something so profoundly poignant in this time of where we can't touch each other's hands, or outside of sort of our pods, or, that there's so much anxiety fused around, physical touch. And I think of that oftentimes when I look at Tyke, and his peers, that physical proximity and physical intimacy has come to be equated with threat, and not to themselves, but I think so many children are aware of their grandparents and wanting to keep them safe. Um, and I was thinking, in that moment of that touch, how much work we'll probably have to go into conversations with our smallies in society, as to reorientating touch as something beautiful and profound and resourcing and precious. And but yeah, so I'd love at some stage to have another conversation about how you use the screen, because even just having met you through the screen, I can, sense that warmth and that compassion, and how that can be translated, linguistically, through the touch that isn't touch, but yet, people feel it as touch. And I'd say, if to add to the numerous videos that I'm sure are going to show up on the site, I'd say for therapists and practitioners, you speaking to that could be really educational for people. How
Mm.
in this very removed medium can we be fully, as embodied a presence as possible. And I've seen that through my own clinical work online. I think there's a very profound nature to it, even through Zoom. I think there's a lot of self-agency. People can choose where they want to do their therapy, if that's walking by the sea or sitting in their car or, in a forest or wherever they want to go, into that inner landscape. And certainly, there's more choice involved. But yeah, I'd
There's
say we're
something,
all on a path of learning. But yeah.
there's something around intention, and
Yeah.
we've got these moments of silence, or moments of intention, or moments of connect, and it's the silences that are
Yes.
infused with some energy. I
Right.
remember I remember once struggling with a client, actually, and I kind of didn't know where to go. And she was kind of annoying me a bit, which doesn't happen very often. But this, I'm human, and this was happening. And I remember just taking a deep breath internally and saying, just please let me show up with compassion here, because I could feel a judgment coming in. And genuinely, that does not happen me often, because
Mm.
it's the one experience that I can pull back on. But I remember sort of calling in compassion, or calling it out of myself. And a
Mm.
minute or two later, she stopped, and she stopped speaking. We just sat there in silence. And she just kind of looked around and she said, "Wow." And I said, "What's the wow?" And she said, "It's like the room is suddenly flooded with love."
Mm.
And it's true.
Yeah.
I could feel it. It's like, I don't know therapeutically what we call that. But it's like there was this flood of love that came from the intention of wanting to feel compassion rather than judgment.
Mm.
And I can honestly say that I have felt that so often sitting with people I support in front of a screen, where
Mm.
you're just willing them well. It's
Yeah.
a form of love. When you're working with someone for months, I love them.
Yeah.
I feel love
Good.
towards people that I work
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
well-being really matters to me.
Yeah.
I'm not in love with them. That's a different
Yeah.
thing. But and when you
Mm.
feel that, and when you show up with that, and when you're not scared of that, and when you don't hide that behind a boundary, you're just letting it
Mm.
be in your person.
Yeah.
I believe it's felt, and I believe it's
Yes.
healing, and it's healing in terms of an agitated or a dysregulated nervous system can become settled.
Yes.
Moments of silence and pause are possible. Moments
Mm.
of connection, little
Mm.
sprigs of hope can come up in that moment. So
Mm.
there's such profound work that can be done through the body. I'm a firm believer in, that we feel things in our bodies, and we need to support the bodies in order to move through that, especially when trauma is concerned. But
Mm.
I just want to double back real quick to the agency thing as well, in case anyone misinterpreted me. Sometimes when somebody has been through a big trauma or a profound grief, there is a loss of agency. There's a
Mm.
defragmentation, and when I say, we're like a Sherpa, if you like, or we're accompanying someone, there is a while where, sometimes their prefrontal cortex isn't even working. They're in that fog
Mm.
of grief or that fog of trauma. And maybe we step over the line quite a bit, but it's only with integrity and
Mm.
clarity of, giving some direction, not fixing, not advising, but maybe giving some direction. And the minute that the momentum, then they have their momentum, we step back then, and there's a distance, and it's
Mm.
like helping them re-find their agency, if you like. It's
Nice.
like relaunching someone off. Um, it's not like I'm doing this work and right there and taking your agency, But I think with grief and with trauma, we do need to sometimes meet the very
Yes. Where people
distressed
are at.
child that's in front of
Mm,
us.
mm,
And in terms of therapeutic work, Quiva, you asked there, like, we learned that it's not ethical to touch people. And in grief work, I would say it's not ethical not to touch them sometimes.
mm,
I will
mm,
often have a bereaved mother maybe beside me, and I
mm,
will say, is it and in my clinic, I have my room, I don't say clinic normally, I have two sofas, and I
mm,
sit on one and the person I'm supporting is in the other. And sometimes I'll say, is it okay if I come over there, and would that
mm,
feel all right? And
mm.
then it'll be, could I put my hand on your arm? And it's
Mm.
like that,
Yeah, yeah,
that
titrated.
nervous
Mm,
system just comes right down again. So I think when we talk
mm,
about psychotherapy and grief and trauma, it's a whole different feel to what we learn in our psychotherapy trainings and our counseling trainings.
mm. Yeah, yeah. And also in a way, that we can move between those spaces, of I'm thinking in a camp context, that isn't it's not a regulated room, it is a visceral context of loss and suffering, and that in that context, I think on a personal basis where I'm not working therapeutically, I'm there as a friend, as an ally, as a sister, that hugs, make all the difference. Oftentimes, I think for us all, just in the sense of people being seen. And I really resonate, with so much of what you're saying. And I love the fact that you use the word love, and bring that emotional register in, of course, in the same way that if one spends, that very sacred, very intimate time, of exploring trauma and grief with people, you so wish them well. You so want them to be safe, to be well, to be loved, to be, as whole as possible within, all of those, yeah, just layers of grief. And I wonder, in a way, sort of this space, and I see this definitely amongst some of those who I described in the United States, Nakamandafo, and a lot of people who are talking about racial justice, a lot of people that are talking about intergenerational trauma, reframing the therapeutic space into one, that is generative, as well as, yeah, sort of, and within that, I'm just thinking of, that in a way, the power dynamic of trying to sort of, yes, having containment and boundaries, in terms of ethics, but also just being able to say, as a human being, as somebody who feels pain, who empathizes with people who are navigating suffering, that our hearts can break, and be held, but in those moments, of just witness of suffering. Um, and it's interesting because I think in a way any one subjective journey within sort of training as a therapist can weave, I think, the bits that resonate, the bits that don't, and sort of come to a cohesive whole in terms of something that feels congruent with lives lived pre sort of training, or and I feel on a personal level that's sort of the space that I'm at, in a way, weaving that witness of working in a human rights and advocacy sort of context with this, and trying to come out with something that is congruent, and that has my own ethical positioning sort of forefronted within it too. Um, but yeah, but it's so lovely. I think there's oftentimes, and I think of this listening to you, but one thing that I really think is lacking educationally in general across sort of the educational front is the concept of sort of mentorship or of apprenticeships, and they exist so well. I'm thinking of in other sort of educational contexts in Europe where oftentimes children, who aren't resonating, with academic, sort of education, apprentice and learn, really practical skills and trades and, craftspeople. And I oftentimes think of that in a therapeutic milieu of the benefits, of having that sort of apprenticeship, that benefit of the mentoring, the benefit of, being in conversation with people who are decades more into this walk. And then also bringing in, sometimes I think sort of the new ideas, the new iterations, the new growth, and for that to be a collaborative, generative sort of garden. But
And
yeah,
I love
hopefully
that you
more of
bring
it.
that in, because I think younger generations are bringing in, we think that wisdom comes with age, and perhaps it does, but not always.
Often.
But often the younger generation, like I hear my kids and I think, where did you get
Mm,
that?
they're amazing.
My 11-year-old said to me this morning, he was upset about something, about a decision he'd made. And he said, I was just way too rash making that decision, and I had to make the decision quickly. And I didn't have time to process it before I made the decision.
Wow.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
I only learned the word process like 3 years ago or something. And it's just, it
Mm,
makes my heart sing.
Yeah.
So I love that notion of listening to all the ideas,
Yeah.
and we're always learning. And that's something that I put forward very much in my grief education program. Like, I never let anyone call me a grief expert or a grief
Mm,
specialist. And if they do, I correct them. And, I did a master's in bereavement studies. I only work with grief and loss. I have a lot of experience in it. And I am learning every single day,
mm,
and I will continue to learn every single day. And the moment I call myself a grief expert, like, come and find me and remind me, because honestly, just know. And it's so
mm,
disempowering for people to think, if you're the expert, then I'm not.
mm,
And really, we all have the answers to everything inside us if we just have faith in looking. But Creeper,
mm.
we could sit here all night long.
Be
I know
good.
we could. um, it's been
Oh,
such a pleasure and a joy to speak with you. You're such a smart, wise, gorgeous woman.
igualmente.
Gracias,
Completely.
mujer.
Y compañera. Yeah, a total pleasure too. And I really can't wait to see just how the resources that you're producing can subtly empower people, because that is education at its core. It's emancipatory, it's liberatory, and it just opens up that space that people can row in, see themselves, in the other, and also really validate their own lived experiences. So yeah, I think it's
Thank you. And
great.
it's,
Keep
it's
on
meant to be
cooking.
a portal. I want people to come in and they think they
Mm,
know lots about grief, and they come in, and then at the very least that they go, wow, I really hadn't a clue. And where am I going to continue learning?
yeah.
They will learn a lot, on the Shapes of Grief education program. And I hope it will propel them into learning even more. But
Mm,
it's been so lovely to be
bravo.
joined by you, Caoimhe, for the podcast. And I look forward to your teachings for the grief education program as well when the next module goes live.
Thank you. Be well.
You too, Caoimhe.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapes of Grief. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice, and if your grief is making you unwell, please do see your healthcare provider. Once again, please consider supporting the podcast by donating on shapesofgrief.com or becoming a patron on patreon.com. I rely on your support to keep going. The music is performed by Bacca Beyond, especially for the Shapes of Grief podcast. Until the next time, from me, Liz Gleeson, take really good care.
On a storm-torn shoreline, a woman was standing. The spray hung like jewels in her hair. 'Neath the rock of that desolate landing. Oh, as though there were none, she stood there. She has come down to condemn and their eyes are bound round with ship's sail. She has come down to condemn the wide ocean for the murderous loss of her man. His boat sailed out last Wednesday morning, and it's feared she's gone down with all hands. Oh, it's feared she's gone down with all hands. Yes, it's feared she's gone down with all hands.
Gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous.